It was one of those calm Saturday afternoons when the entire neighborhood seemed to slow down under the warm sunlight. The kind of quiet suburban moment where nothing dramatic ever seems to happen. And I had just finished spending most of the morning cleaning out my garage, sorting through old boxes, moving tools around, and getting rid of things I should have thrown away years earlier. So when I finally finished, I grabbed the old blue folding chair I kept leaning against the garage wall, carried it to the edge of my driveway, and sat down facing the street with a cold glass of iced tea in my hand, simply enjoying the breeze and the peaceful feeling of not having anything urgent left to do for the rest of the afternoon. I had lived in that house for about 7 years at that point, and the street was normally the kind of quiet suburban block where people mostly minded their own business, waved politely when passing each other, and occasionally chatted while getting the mail or walking their dogs. But like every neighborhood, there were a few personalities who made things a little more complicated. And one of those people was a woman named Linda who had moved into the house 2 doors down about a year earlier and had quickly developed a reputation for involving herself in things that really had nothing to do with her. The first time I met Linda was during a birthday party we had for my daughter, when she walked over uninvited to complain that someone had parked too close to her mailbox, even though the car was still well within the legal parking space on the street. And the second time was when she knocked on my door early one morning asking if I knew who had left their trash bin slightly crooked near the curb, because it apparently bothered her sense of order. So after those few encounters, I had learned that it was usually easier to keep interactions with her short, polite, and limited whenever possible. That afternoon, though, I wasn't thinking about Linda at all as I leaned back in my folding chair at the edge of the driveway, occasionally checking my phone, sipping my iced tea, and watching the quiet activity of the street as a couple of kids rode their scooters past the house. A neighbor across the block washed his car in slow motion under the sun, and somewhere down the street someone started a lawn mower that hummed steadily in the background, like white noise on an otherwise peaceful day. After about 20 minutes of sitting there enjoying the break, I happened to glance across the street and noticed Linda standing at the edge of her driveway, with her arms folded, staring directly in my direction in a way that felt a little too focused to be casual curiosity. But at first I didn't think much of it because neighbors look around all the time, so I gave a small wave out of habit just to acknowledge her presence the way people normally do in quiet neighborhoods like ours. She didn't wave back though, and instead of returning the simple greeting, she began walking across the street toward my driveway with a serious expression on her face, which immediately gave me the feeling that whatever she wanted to say probably wasn't going to be a friendly conversation about the weather or weekend plans. And when she reached the edge of the driveway, she stopped, looked at the folding chair, then looked back at me like she was inspecting something unusual. "Can I help you?" I asked casually, expecting maybe a quick question about something in the neighborhood. But instead she frowned slightly and said, "What are you doing?" in a tone that sounded more like an accusation than a simple question, which caught me off guard enough that I paused for a second before answering the obvious. "I'm sitting," I replied calmly, gesturing slightly at the chair beneath me as if the situation should be self-explanatory. But she shook her head slowly and said, "You've been sitting here for a while," which somehow made the situation sound suspicious even though I was literally in my own driveway on a quiet afternoon doing absolutely nothing out of the ordinary. "Yeah," I said with a small shrug. "I just finished working in the garage and decided to take a break." But she didn't seem satisfied with that explanation at all, and instead crossed her arms tighter before saying, "It's strange to sit out here like that," which made me glance up and down the street again just to make sure I hadn't accidentally broken some new neighborhood rule about enjoying fresh air. "Strange how?" I asked, genuinely curious about what exactly she thought the problem was. And she answered, "You're watching the street," which made me laugh a little because watching the street is pretty much what everyone does when they sit outside their homes. But I kept my tone calm and said, "Well, yeah, that's what happens when you sit outside," hoping that common sense would end the conversation right there. Instead, she shook her head again and said, "It makes people uncomfortable," which surprised me enough that I looked around once more at the completely normal neighborhood scene, where no one seemed even remotely concerned, and I replied, "I think everyone's fine." But she quickly responded, "Well, I'm not," as if that alone was supposed to settle the matter. At that point, I figured the easiest solution was simply to end the conversation politely and move on with my day, so I leaned back in the folding chair, picked up my phone again, and said, "All right then, assuming she would go back across the street once she realized there wasn't anything more to argue about, but instead she stood there for a few seconds staring at me before reaching into her purse and pulling out her own phone. At first, I assumed she was texting someone or making a personal call, but the moment she dialed and said, "Hello, I'd like to report suspicious activity in my neighborhood," I slowly looked up from my chair in disbelief because it suddenly became clear that she was actually calling the police about the extremely dangerous situation of a man sitting in a folding chair outside his own house on a Saturday afternoon. "You're kidding," I said, half laughing at the absurdity of the situation. But she ignored me and continued talking to the dispatcher, as if she were reporting something serious, explaining that there was a man sitting at the edge of his driveway watching people, which made the whole thing sound like some kind of surveillance operation instead of what it really was, which was a guy drinking iced tea and enjoying a quiet afternoon. By that point, a couple walking their dog slowed down on the sidewalk to see what was happening, and my next-door neighbor Mark came outside after hearing the raised voices, asking what was going on. So I told him, apparently sitting outside my house is suspicious now, which made him look at Linda with a confused expression before asking, "You called the cops on him for that?" While she continued describing my folding chair like it was evidence in a criminal investigation. About 5 minutes later, a police cruiser slowly turned onto the street and parked near the curb in front of my house, and 2 officers stepped out and approached the driveway while several curious neighbors watched from their yards and porches, clearly entertained by the idea that the police had been called to investigate a man relaxing in his own driveway. And when one of the officers asked what the problem was, Linda immediately pointed at me and said, "That's him," as if I had been caught in the middle of some elaborate wrongdoing. The officer looked at me sitting calmly in the folding chair, holding a glass of iced tea, and asked, "Sir, what's going on here?" So I answered honestly, "I'm sitting in my driveway," which made him glance down at the chair before nodding slowly and asking, "You live here?" And when I told him I had lived there for 7 years, he walked back toward his partner and Linda while trying not to smile as she continued explaining that I had been watching the neighborhood for an extended period of time. After listening patiently, the officer finally said in a calm voice that sitting outside your own home is not illegal and that there was no crime taking place, while several neighbors nearby tried unsuccessfully to hide their laughter at the seriousness with which the situation had been reported. And when Linda insisted that someone should do something about it, the officer politely reminded her that emergency services should only be called for real emergencies, not for someone relaxing in a folding chair. The officers eventually returned to their patrol car and drove away, leaving the entire street in an awkward silence for a moment before Mark burst out laughing and said he couldn't believe the police had just been called because I was sitting outside, while other neighbors shook their heads in disbelief and returned to whatever they had been doing earlier. And the funniest part of the whole thing was that after all that drama, I simply leaned back in the same folding chair, took another sip of iced tea, and continued enjoying the rest of the peaceful Saturday afternoon exactly where I had been the entire time.